Right, shall we start the meeting then? Right, so this welcome everybody. This afternoon we've got Roger talking about the Third International. Roger said that it's a very large subject and he's not going to be able to cover the whole of it this afternoon. So he's going to concentrate on the formation of the Third International and the way it's overlapped from the Second International. So because it's a large subject, I know we normally say about 20 minutes for speakers, Roger's asked for up to half an hour. So my proposal, Roger, is I tell you when you've got to 25 minutes, and that gives you time to sort of collect the last few minutes together. Is that okay? Can I just ask everybody to make sure they're muted unless they're speaking, just so we don't get any background noises? Okay, right.
Okay, well, comrades, I found this a bit harder to prepare than I'd expected, because the history of the Third International is inextricable from the history of the Russian Revolution, from its inspiring beginning to its bitter end. So its birth, its crises, its corruption, its decay, its eventual strangulation. But the International, we have to understand, nevertheless, it was the product of a continental-wide revolution, the like of which had never been seen before. Now, in this series, we've looked so far at the creation of the First and the Second Internationals. The first was brought to an end by the crushing of the Paris Commune, and the second by an even more catastrophic defeat, the First World War. And this time we're focusing on how it was that a new international could arise so soon afterwards from the ashes. It's almost a century since the decline of the Communist International, and nothing comparable has arisen in its place. And that makes the project of a single party of the world working class look today like a sort of romantic pipe dream, a mirage, or worse still, the obsession of sectarian cranks. But that's not how it always seemed. As we saw, the Times compared the creation of the First International to the birth of Christianity. Engels considered the foundation of the Socialist International the consummation of his and Marx's life work. As he put it, that the eternal union of the proletarians of all countries is still alive and lives stronger than ever. There is no better witness than this day. And today's spectacle will open the eyes of the capitalists and landlords of all countries to the fact that today the working men of all countries are united indeed. And he ended by saying, if only Marx was still by my side to see this with his own eyes. So also to millions around the world, the new international, the third, was not just not a dream, it was actually the most real and the most vital factor in their lives. Just as the main base of the First International had been in Britain, where Marx and Engels worked alongside the London Trades Council, and the second in Germany, where a thriving mass Marxist Social Democratic Party was being built. So the Third International, in its turn, was created in Russia by the world's first successful proletarian revolution. And the rise and the fall of the International is inseparable from the victory and then the decline and decay of the Russian Revolution. It was not at all fanciful or utopian for the Russian workers to see their revolution as the beginning of a new stage in human history, a new world. They saw their struggle in the context of a European-wide revolution. After all, only 5 years previously, as we saw last time, in November 1912, the Socialist International, which was not a sect, but the established voice of the organized working class throughout Europe and beyond, meeting at an extraordinary Congress in Basel, had unanimously warned the ruling class of Europe, let the governments remember that they cannot unleash a war without danger to themselves. It would be insanity for the governments not to realize that the very idea of the monstrosity of a world war would inevitably call forth the indignation and the revolt of the working class. And lo and behold, in actual fact, within months of their own uprising, revolution really was raging, not just in Russia, but throughout Germany, Austria, Hungary, Poland, Italy, France, and elsewhere. The royal dynasties of Europe were dethroned, the Romanovs, the Hohenzollerns, and the Habsburgs tossed into oblivion. Britain saw the general strike on the Clyde, the mutinies among the British forces in France, the Triple Alliance of trade unions, the mass councils of action which sprang up expressly to defend the Russian Revolution and impede the intervention, councils which Lenin called Soviets in essence, if not in name. The British Prime Minister Lloyd George wrote in a confidential memorandum, "The whole of Europe is filled with the spirit of revolution." It was fear of revolution that caused King George V of Britain to refuse sanctuary to his cousin Tsar Nicholas and to abandon him to his fate. Another cousin, by the way, all three of them having been grandsons of Queen Victoria, was Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, who was likewise overthrown. The mass of participants in the Russian Revolution understood that they were part of an international event. On the very day of the October Revolution, the resolution of the Petrograd Soviet declared that, quote again, "the proletariats of the countries of Western Europe will aid us in conducting the cause of socialism to a real and lasting victory." In his own classic eyewitness account, the American journalist John Reed recorded the common thoughts of working-class Petrograd insurgents on the streets. The way he put it was, now there was all great Russia to win, and then the world. So the historic proclamation made the next day to the Congress of Soviets ended with an explicit call to the workers of Britain, France, and Germany, again a quote, "to help us to bring to a successful conclusion the cause of the liberation of the exploited working masses from all slavery and exploitation." Lenin addressed the delegates with the prediction that, again, quote, "revolution will soon break out in all the belligerent countries." Trotsky warned that if Europe continues to be ruled by the imperialist bourgeoisie, revolutionary Russia will inevitably be lost. Either the Russian Revolution will create a revolutionary movement in Europe, or the European powers will destroy the Russian Revolution. And Reed reports that they greeted him with an immense crusading acclaim. Reed quotes a Red Guard who, again, quote, "plied me with questions about America. Are the American workers ready to overthrow the capitalists?" A soldier fresh from the front said, "We will hold the fort with all our strength until the peoples of the world arise." And he then addressed Reed directly. He said, "Tell the American workers to rise and fight for the socialist revolution." And Reed continued, "Something was kindled in these men. One spoke of the coming world revolution, of which we are the advance guard. Another of the new age of brotherhood, when all the peoples will become one great family." And after all, we quoted it before, but remember that before the war, the International had issued blood-curdling warnings to the ruling class. Let them remember, they thundered, that the Franco-German War was followed by the revolutionary outbreak of the Commune, and that the Russo-Japanese War set in motion the revolutionary forces of the peoples of the Russian Empire. And perhaps few of the delegates who enthusiastically endorsed this resolution understood quite how uncannily accurate it was, because for all their ringing rhetoric, with the ink hardly dry on the declaration in that same resolution that the proletarians consider it a crime to fire at each other for the benefit of the capitalist profits, the ambitions of dynasties, or the greater glory of secret diplomatic treaties, when it came to the issue, the British Labour Party entered the wartime coalition, the Belgian and French socialists likewise joined theirs, the German, Austrian and South African socialists, and plus the Australian Labour government all collaborated in supporting the war. The old international was shattered. Only the ILP, some Russian Mensheviks and SRs, and Kautsky gave kind of passive and half-hearted opposition to the war, and it was left to the Bolsheviks, the German Spartacists, and a handful of scattered allies to maintain revolutionary opposition to the war. Lenin had considered himself a champion of the mainstream of the international, along with Kautsky resisting the revisionist heresies of Bernstein, the prophet of reformism. And when the war was declared, Lenin was in Switzerland in exile, And he was at first literally incredulous when he saw the front page of Vorwärts, the SPD newspaper, reporting on their support for the Kaiser's war credits in the Reichstag. He assumed that this must be a forgery by the German General Staff, because the Socialist International had, to its eternal shame, betrayed its ringing call just 5 years earlier for a European-wide general strike in the event of war. At this critical hour, the workers found themselves politically disarmed. Amid the blood and horror of the World War and on the eve of revolutionary upheavals dwarfing those of 1848, they were left leaderless. And in these dark years, the spirit of socialist internationalism remained only in the minds of a handful of isolated individuals. So the new international was conceived in 1915 when a handful of socialists opposed to the war gathered together in Zimmerwald in Switzerland. And the Zimmerwald left, the revolutionary wing, had a grand total between them of 8 delegates. At the Kiental conference the following year, it had increased its strength by half to 12. And yet only a year later, the workers were already in power in Russia and the new international was being built. It grew out of worldwide solidarity with the Russian workers and soldiers, because 21 foreign imperialist armies had poured into Russia in a concerted attempt to crush the revolution in its cradle. At one point, only a small area surrounding Moscow and extending barely to Petrograd had been in the hands of the Red Army. Russia was starved of arms, but the Bolsheviks had greeted the enemy soldiers with leaflets printed in all their languages, explaining that they had been sent by their bosses to crush a workers' republic, reporting the news of the revolution raging throughout Europe, and appealing for active help. And this had an immediate effect on the foreign troops of the intervention, who were themselves obviously war-weary workers in uniform. It was the power of workers' internationalism, therefore, that saved the Russian Revolution. There were mutinies in the French fleet stationed off Odessa and in the British, German, Czechoslovak and other armies. In Britain, the TUC condemned the Siberian occupation in September 1919, and Siberia was evacuated within days. Councils of action had sprung up throughout Britain to defend the Russian Revolution. In May 1920, the men in London's East India docks refused to load the Jolly George ship with hidden cachements of arms. Mass demonstrations were held throughout the country. A joint meeting of the TUC, the Labour Party NEC, and the Parliamentary Labour Party, which sounds unlikely now, threatened a general strike. General Golovin reported on his negotiations with Winston Churchill in May 1919 as follows. He said, "The question of giving armed support was for him the most difficult one. The reason for this was the opposition of the British working class to armed intervention." And that's how the intervention failed. And the Red Army mopped up the native Tsarist relics within a few weeks at indescribable cost. For the moment, the revolution survived. Now, no one studying the history of that time could doubt the global consciousness of its participants and the spirit of international solidarity pulsing through the veins and embodied in the words of its leaders. Lenin emphasized, for instance, that without aid from the international world revolution, a victory of the proletarian revolution is impossible. We did our utmost to preserve the Soviet system under any circumstances and at all costs, because we knew that we are working not only for ourselves, but also for the international revolution. In March 1918, he wrote that there could be no hope of the ultimate victory of our revolution if it were to remain alone. If the German Revolution doesn't come, we are doomed. In fact, in the emergency debate in 1918 over whether or not to seek a peace treaty with Germany, Lenin had even said that if necessary, we should sacrifice our own revolution, since the German Revolution will be far more powerful for ours. And he said, if it were to remain alone, if there were no revolutionary movements in other countries, then the final victory of our revolution would be hopeless. Our salvation from all these difficulties is an all-European revolution. So that's why, I'm sorry that was a long preamble, but that's why the supreme task, therefore, was the foundation of the Communist International. With workers' governments already in power in Russia and briefly in Hungary and in Bavaria too, the new international was founded in March 1919. Now, I have to ask the question because it's been asked repeatedly, including to people by people quite close to us. Why was it necessary to declare war on the parties of the old international and build a third international? Had there not been debates raging within the Second International for years without anyone posing the need to split the organization? And the answer is that the nature of the discussion had changed. The argument was now being conducted in very, very different language, not in speeches, resolutions, and polite debate, but in bullets, bombs, and murder. The debate was being waged in blood across the barricades. Ebert, Noske, and Scheidemann, leaders of the German Social Democratic Party, were mobilizing and arming the Freikorps, the military, paramilitary gangster battalions and prototypes of the Nazis who murdered revolutionary workers, soldiers, and sailors, among them Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, heroes of the German proletariat. And not only in Germany. James Connolly, Irish revolutionary and co-leader of the Easter Rising, was wheeled from a hospital bed, strapped to a chair, and shot by firing squad on the orders of a British war cabinet, which included the Labour Party leader, Arthur Henderson. Social Democratic leaders were enthusiastically supporting the invasion of revolutionary Russia by, as I've explained, no fewer than 21 foreign counter-revolutionary armies. Mensheviks, former fellow members alongside Lenin and Trotsky of the same Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, were collaborating with Tsarist white guards and foreign mercenaries in the Russian Civil War. And let's not forget that following the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks really had, in fact, not only offered a united front, but actually handed over ministerial portfolios in a coalition government to the left social revolutionaries. And now it was a left social revolutionary who fired shots at Lenin and almost succeeded in assassinating him. So there's a widespread misconception that the foundation of the Communist International was some kind of ultra-left sectarian indulgence. And this myth later seemed to gain some superficial substance from subsequent developments. The incipient rash of ultra-leftism that did taint some of the early communist parties. The impression of ultimatism given by the new international's famous 21 conditions for membership, which I'm coming to a bit later. Its announcement of a permanent ban on certain named prominent individuals. And of course, under Stalin later, the outright abuse of the principle of democratic centralism and Stalin's adoption at a critical time, most grossly and most criminally, of a monstrously lunatic adventurism in branding the Social Democrats social fascists and actually colluding with the Nazis to split the German working class and thus ensure its annihilation. But the truth is different. Lenin and Trotsky could not reasonably be accused of having split the international because there was no international to split. Since the 1912 Congress of the Socialist International, for all its ringing declarations and stern warnings to the ruling classes of the revolutionary consequences of a new imperialist war, it never met again. Not once. From 1914 to 1918, the hundreds of thousands of workers owing allegiance to this mass international were meeting together not at international conferences to debate resolutions, but in rival army uniforms on the battlefields of Europe to kill one another, to slaughter one another by the millions on the express instructions and the direct decision of the leaders of the now disintegrated international's respective national sections. Even formally speaking, the Socialist International was legally dissolved in 1916. So not only was there no organization to split from, there was not any splinter remaining of its constituent parts. So not for the first time, nor the last, for a period, the International survived only in the persons of scattered individuals or small groups. During the World War, it was embodied solely in the delegates to the little gatherings that I've explained in Zimmerwald in 1915 and Kiental the following year, and their handfuls of supporters at home or exile. So should they not have held these secret meetings during the war? And if so, what for, if not to plan the creation of new parties capable of overthrowing the ruling class? And once the war was over, mainly due to the flood of revolution and mutiny afflicting the belligerent powers, should the Timberwolf left have then quietly dissolved? Or were they right to resolve to build a new international on the ashes of the old? Could anyone seriously suggest that at this time the new international could have offered a united front with these traitors of 1914, even if they had wanted to? The most important question for us is, who formed the Communist International? Was it a collection of misfits and rebels? Did it grow out of fringe sects? On the contrary, it was in the same mould and tradition as the First International, which was an alliance of all genuine working class organisations, and the Second International, which had brought together all mass social democratic parties and initially trade union organisations too. So far from a coven of sectarians, the new international had a truly mass base. Conference after conference voted to affiliate to the Communist International. What was its composition? The Russian Bolsheviks, who numbered hundreds of thousands and had constituted the majority of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. From Germany, the majority wing of the Independents, who had been the proletarian backbone of the old Social Democratic Party. The French Socialist Party, at its Tour conference in 1921, voted to affiliate en bloc to the Third International. The Italian Socialist Party, at its conference, voted to affiliate. The Norwegian Labour Party affiliated. The Swedish Left Socialists, who came from the Social Democratic Party, affiliated. The Swiss Socialist Party, at its conference, voted to affiliate. The Hungarian Social Democrats amalgamated with the Communist Party. The Bulgarian Social Democrats affiliated. The majority of the Czechoslovak Social Democrats affiliated. The Socialist Party of the USA, in a referendum, voted to affiliate. There were even mass trade union organizations such as the Spanish CGT, the Italian Syndicalists, and the South Wales Miners' Federation, which affiliated directly to the Communist International. The list of affiliates to the new international reads like a roll call of former members of the Second International. Of course, in some cases, there were maneuvers by the bureaucratic leaders of the old parties to obstruct this movement. The decision of the Swiss Socialist Conference was reversed after a referendum. The leaders of the American Socialist Party rejected the decision of the membership. The leaders of the Czechoslovak Social Democrats postponed their conference when it became clear that it would vote to affiliate, and the Hungarian Social Democrats later split away again. But they could not stop the tidal wave of workers flooding towards the new international. And whatever the machinations of the old leaders in obstructing, reversing, or derailing the process, and whatever mistakes were made by the left, the birth of a new mass revolutionary international was secured. Now, did the Bolsheviks make mistakes? Bertolt Brecht once suggested that revolutionaries should now and again publish a list of their mistakes so as to protect themselves against accusations that they are always right. So we can give a list. Lenin's earlier formulation of the tasks of the coming Russian Revolution have been imprecise or algebraic, as Trotsky put it. Trotsky acknowledged his own mistake in, notwithstanding these earlier differences, remaining outside the Bolshevik fraction. Lenin was mistaken in supporting the Red Army's invasion of Poland. Trotsky had a mistaken position in 1921 on the trade union question. Will this do for a start? But one thing Lenin and Trotsky were definitely not wrong about was to rescue the tradition of workers' internationalism by founding the Communist International in 1919. Far from splitting the international, what they did was to rebuild the international out of the rubble of the World War after its old leaders had smashed it to smithereens in 1914. It is those same criminal leaders stained with the blood of millions of loyal workers slaughtered in the war who were guilty of splitting the international by their betrayal. Now, the first Congress of the Communist International was not much bigger than this meeting today, although, to be fair, on the other hand, the workers were already in power in 3 countries then. It met in Moscow in March 1919 in extreme conditions of siege and civil war. Only 51 delegates attended. Due to the international blockade, no one made it from Italy, France, Britain, or the USA, and due to these hazards, many of those who did participate arrived late, and one German delegate was actually arrested at the border. By the time of the Second Congress, which met in Petrograd in July and August 1920, still at the height of a raging civil war and multiple foreign invasions, there were nevertheless 218 delegates present from 37 countries.
Roger, you've been going 25 minutes.
Oh, well, if you don't mind, give me just a few minutes more. I won't be, I'll do my
Yeah,
best.
we said up to 30, yeah, okay.
So popular was the International already becoming that its leaders had to take special precautions to ensure that it avoided the risk of dilution into a new version of the Second International. So the IEC resolution stated, the Communist International is becoming to some extent fashionable. There is a danger of dilution by unstable and irresolute elements which have not yet completely discarded the ideology of the Second International. And all the more reason then for special measures to immunize the new organism against the danger of contamination. And that's why the new International laid down its famous 21 strict conditions of membership, explicitly rejecting in advance from future prospective membership a list of known named individuals who would be permanently ineligible. And here's the quotes: the Communist International cannot tolerate a situation where notorious opportunists, as represented by Turati, Modigliani, Kautsky, Hilferding, Wilkwitz, Longe, MacDonald, etc., have the right to pass as members of the Communist International. This could only lead to the Communist International becoming something very similar to the wreck of the Second International. And of course, we could all have a lot of fun drawing up lists of our own of people that we would exclude once the new International is being created. But was this sectarianism? In the condition of the time, no. It was a tribute to the power and principle of the leadership of the new International that they were prepared to sacrifice alluring superficial gains in order to maintain their revolutionary principles intact, and without at the same time falling into the trap of sectarianism. Rather than accept Turati into the Communist International, they were prepared to split the Italian Socialist Party. And rather than make concessions on the principle of essential international discipline, they were prepared to lose the affiliation of the Norwegian Labour Party in 1923. And that's how they built what remained for now a genuine international. Now, at the Third Congress in June and July 1921, there were already 509 delegates, rising to 603 from 48 countries. But already by that time, the tide of history was beginning to turn against the revolution, and Lenin and Trotsky only with difficulty succeeded in curbing the adventurous exuberance of an ultra-left majority. And Lenin stated openly that it was necessary to make a turn to the right. And Trotsky soon afterwards described the change in the objective situation between the first two congresses of the Communist International and the second two. In 1919 and 1920, he wrote, it was considered virtually self-evident that the constantly rising and intensifying political ferment of the masses, growing out of the social paroxysms of the war, must lead directly to the conquest of power by the proletariat. But by the time of the Third Congress in 1921, he wrote, the tempo of development proved to be different. War did not lead directly to the victory of the proletariat in Western Europe. It is all too obvious just what was lacking for victory in 1919 and 1920. A revolutionary party was lacking. Not until the powerful post-war mass ferment had already begun to ebb did young communist parties begin to take shape, and then only in rough outline. Germany was now the key to the class balance of forces, and this is really the last section. It was in the throes of wild and violent fluctuations, from the mass general strikes and the military and naval mutinies that had overthrown the ruling dynasty and brought an end to the war, to the mobilization of the fascist paramilitary Freikorps in its rampage of terror, to the attempted monarchist putsch led by Kapp, to his humiliation and disarmament at the hands of the workers of Berlin, to a new wave of strikes, occupations, and uprisings. And the crucial test came in 1923. Germany was by now racked in intense and unprecedented crisis. Hyperinflation had soared to the extent that a wheelbarrow of banknotes would hardly buy a box of matches. French and Belgian armies had occupied the industrial heartland in the Ruhr. The Nazis made their first attempted putsch in Munich, and the working class was ready for insurrection. And in this situation, what was missing was the insight and strategic leadership that had saved the Russian Revolution, because the failure of the International reflected the ebbing revolutionary mood within Russia. In a state of retreat, isolation, and hostile encirclement, bitter concessions to foreign companies, native entrepreneurs, and a privileged bureaucratic caste had become unavoidable. Vile elements were crawling out of the crevices once the harsh regime of war communism had been replaced by a new economic policy under which painful concessions had been wrung out of the government, permitting a limited license to private entrepreneurs. Worse still, in the extreme conditions of a backward and isolated Russia, there was no alternative but to enlist the services of the administrative personnel of the old Tsarist regime, luring them back by conceding to them a relaxation on the limit to their payment to allow a maximum wage differential of 4-1, which soon under Stalin swelled beyond control. And it was a concession frankly admitted by Lenin to be a capitalist differential. And that's what Lenin meant when he complained that we still have the same old Tsarist state machine today with a thin veneer of socialism spread on top. Demoralized at the isolation of their revolution, nauseated by the antics of the so-called net men, the speculators, the kulaks, the profiteers, the black marketeers, and taunted by the return of a triumphant bureaucracy, it's hardly surprising that the Russian working class fell under the darkening shadow of a new form of despotism. And in such conditions, the party drowned in a cesspool of careerism. It was a sly and ambitious mediocrity Stalin, previously described as a grey blur, a perfect personification of the resurgent bureaucracy, who surreptitiously accumulated more and more administrative power into his own hands. The dead hand of the growing bureaucracy within Russia had already begun to stifle the creative revolutionary spirit of the International. By November, the German Revolution had been derailed. As Trotsky described it, the revolution failed not because it generally had not matured, but because the decisive link, the leadership, dropped out of the chain at the decisive moment. And I'll just finish by saying that it was Trotsky who strenuously opposed with every fiber of his being the lunatic caricature of ultra-leftism later practiced by Stalin and his puppets in their so-called third period, when they had refused to stand together with the Social Democrats in a united front against fascism, and instead forged a bloc with the Nazis and denounced the Social Democrats as social fascists. And it's therefore Stalinism, not Leninism, that is criminally stained with responsibility for the crushing of the working class under the jackboot of fascism. Because even that brilliant creation of the revolutionary workers was destroyed by the terrible era of reaction which followed. It was obstinate bureaucratic blunders that derailed the revolution in Germany in 1923, and then it was opportunist maneuvers in Britain at the time of the general strike in 1926, fatal concessions to the capitalist Kuomintang in China in 1927, which led to a bloodbath of communists. And all of that opened up a new dark age of worldwide counter-revolution, which rotted the Communist International. The treacherous policy of socialism in one country, which destroyed the International, was rooted in the material privileges of the bureaucratic clique in Russia. And the existence of that clique was due in turn to the isolation of the revolution to backward Russia and the advance of world reaction. Eventually, the Comintern became so distorted by the interests of the Tsarist bureaucracy that the workers were led to that crushing defeat in Germany in 1933, a defeat more catastrophic even than the betrayal of 1914. The destruction of the world's strongest labor movement without even a fight was actually celebrated by the Comintern as a victory along the road towards socialism. Policing, bullying, and wholesale expulsions by the bureaucracy had turned the whole movement into a tame lapdog of the Kremlin clique. From that time on, Any hope of reforming the International and restoring its revolutionary traditions was gone. The debate had been brutally terminated with the slaughter of an entire generation of Bolsheviks. Millions perished in the purges and in Stalin's gulags, with millions more led to slavery and genocide in the concentration camps of Europe and the World War. The Comintern became the greatest single obstacle to the socialist revolution, cynically betraying the workers in one country after another into the hands of their executioners. And in 1943, this led to its logical conclusion, the formal dissolution of the Comintern in reference to Stalin's new allies, Roosevelt and Churchill. So that is not the end of the story, nevertheless. Was the International adventuristic? Was it a failed gamble? Or despite its tragic ultimate fate, at its peak, was it not the noblest, the most heroic product of socialist working class solidarity? What then are the prospects for its rebirth in the future on a new foundation? And that's a subject in our series. So thank you, comrades.
Okay, thanks very much, Roger, for that comprehensive account. Who would like to speak? If you could possibly put up your little electronic hand, I won't miss you. Who's going first? Anybody? Temos.
Well, the only thing I would like to stress is what really Roger said about not being a bunch of sectarians, because we are talking about the formation of the international for a long time now, and it always comes down to this attempts to form and reform and form again the Fourth International in terms of small groupings here and there. And this always seems to lead to disaster. And it is important to understand that the international cannot really be formed unless we have mass parties, unless we have the workers in their mass organizations behind such a movement. And it's no accident that the Third International didn't form when the Second International collapsed, but when revolutionary events started to take place, and when mass movements, and we shouldn't forget that the Bolsheviks were a mass movement, it wasn't just a small group, started to have a real credence within the working class. And what was true of the international then is probably going to be true when if any new international happens, but it's certainly not true when just small groups try to form policies in an era of reaction where no revolution is on the cards.
Thank you, Temos.
Yes.
Anybody else? Peter. Peter Sinclair.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, to follow on what Temos has just said, the difficulty we have these days, as opposed to what happened in the early 1900s, is simple. There's a mass media against us. We've got something that the Bolsheviks and whoever else couldn't have imagined was going to take place. Television, the monster eye in the corner of almost every living room in the whole world. Well, certainly in the Western world anyway. And it's spewing out nonsense day after day after day. If that's not bad enough, it's backed up by the written press. Most people, and again in the Western world, read newspapers, and almost every newspaper is straight to the far right. That's something that they never had to put up with in those days, and I think that's what made it I'm not going to say easy, but easier than it would be today. And then, of course, you've got a collective of far-right trade union, not just in this country, but certainly in America and almost certainly in much of the Western world too. And that's a huge difficulty that nobody could have predicted all those years ago. How do we get around it? How do we get someone to lead who's powerful enough to have a fourth international? I don't know the answer, and I'm not sure if anybody really does.
Anybody else? Do you want to come back and respond to any of that, Roger, while people are thinking?
Well, I'd rather wait till a few more comments are spoken.
Just waiting for some hands to go up. Anybody want to ask a question? Welcome to anybody that's just joined the meeting. I see Graham's managed to join us. That's good. Carol.
I don't actually have a question, but I always get, and maybe you can help me with this, Roger, that from either anarchists or social democrats or liberals, that Lenin, I put in the chat box, by the way, you know, a film that I think everybody, it's on YouTube, it's definitely worth watching, that Lenin led to Stalin, that his policies, he may not have been a brute in the way, nobody argues that, in the way that Stalin is a brute, but his policies of this vanguard party and you know, there's a certain degree of democracy, but on the other hand, the leaders run things, and so we wouldn't have had Stalin had it not been for Lenin. So how would you respond to that question or that query?
Thanks, Carol. Anybody else? Dominic. Dominic.
Yeah, just unmuting. It's just a short point, but I think Peter's point is somewhat pessimistic. When you look at the situation in Britain today, who would have predicted 2 years ago that you're going to have a mass strike action among the working class in Britain? You know, every sector of organised labour seems to be involved, particularly the sections in the public service, you know. Pardon me, I've got a cough. So I think that it's not the opposition in the sense of the press and all that. It's a question of what the score is as far as the working class is concerned, because the working class has been taught to be passive and to take what's there. But when faced with a real crisis as far as it goes about living standards and about their own, you know, ability to fund their lives, they've got no other option but to take action. It's going to be the events that are going to take place. And I think this is only the start of it, as I would say. I don't think it's going to be a short period. It's going to be a prolonged period because the capitalists are not in a position, as far as they're concerned, to turn around and make concessions. They see their position weakening because the rate of profit that they're making is declining or tending to decline. And they're just not going to take it. They've had a passive working class in this country for a long period, a passive labour movement. And I think the thing is, the challenge is going to be open to the workers in the turmoil that's coming about what sort of leadership they develop, what sort of people they have, you know, who are organising for them. Because they'll soon find out, if Labour's elected, that it's not that much difference from the Tories. So the whole question of what sort of political organisations are the working class going to have will come on the cards. And the trade union leaders won't be able to turn round and say, well, you know, we've got to wait for the next Tory government, next Labour government, or there's got to be a change there. They'll see the rawness of, what's his name, Keir Starmer, that is basically just another chapter in the Tory domination and pardon me, an exploitation of the workers. So I think it's a rather sort of crude putting over, but it's the events that are going to hit people. It's not going to be the question of what's in a newspaper, because the other side of the coin is that workers in this country now can send out and have meetings like this to workers across the world. It's not a, you know, a closed book that their communications are shut off. I mean, the capitalists will try to do that, but people will find their way around it, in my view. So it's very jumbled, but I'll leave it at that.
That's very much Dominic. Matthew.
Sure. Sorry, I'll just make sure I'm muting myself and put the camera on. Yeah, okay. No, thanks for Roger for that. I think there's a few things in there that just as a brief point. I mean, first of all, I think that one important point is, of course, that actually, of course, the Russian Revolution does fundamental and lasting and irreparable damage to capitalism. I mean, actually, you know, you can look at capitalism now and it's like a building with part of its foundations blown out, you know, which has been propped up. And actually, it's the Russian Revolution which announces that there is an alternative to capitalism, and that the process is for capitalism itself to be replaced. And the ruling class understands one of the more conscious elements of the ruling class, particularly obviously finance capital, because obviously that's part of its function, is to be a very highly conscious and international operation of capital, that it's on notice, that it is constantly looking over its shoulder. So, you know, its opponent, the working class. You know, and you can see obviously the sort of effort that's been put in order to attempt to control the system. I mean, you know, over the last 35 years, there's been a series of crises, all of which have been there's been an effort to control these consciously, particularly through the agencies of the state, more or less successfully, in order to try and keep the system going and prevent you know, a widespread social collapse or other such, you know, crises which actually threaten the structure of society. You know, you can see we'll walk through the whole business of 2007-8 and the rest of it, but you can go back to the 80s and Greenspan and so on. It's quite ironic actually, because Greenspan followed Ayn Rand, and then of course spent his entire career doing exactly the reverse. The point also is about the importance of Stalinism, and the thing is, the importance of Stalinism is it itself actually stabilizes capitalism and obstructs revolution, because obviously we can see, I mean, both through the slaughter of the Bolshevik generation and a whole series of other people, that it wipes out that revolutionary generation, and at the same time it prevents the arising of any other revolutionary formation, you know, by assaulting things, including just killing people. You know, so that actually, you know, maintains stability, and that's vital in places like after the Second World War, in which the stability of capitalism was clear. You know, the fact that capitalism is re-established in France or Italy or Vietnam, or, you know, all of these you know, places, the Stalinists are central and vital to that. And you can even see it in terms of the effect of 2007-8, where in fact the capitalism is actually revived by the actions of the Chinese bureaucracy, and holds up the world economy. That's an extraordinary thing, you know, given what's happened since. But there's no question that's the case. And so the question really then becomes, okay, well, what is the nature? You know, if you're looking at the Third International, you know, the question is to go through in terms of some of the things that were done and look at where the mistakes are. I mean, such as the sort of, I mean, obviously you can look and say, well, in Germany, I mean, centrally in Germany, obviously the mistakes of the Spartacus Bund in not protecting its leaders, as is pointed out, they could have stopped the Freikorps from coming into Berlin. All they had to do was stop the damn trains and prevent these guys from getting in the city. They allowed them to go. They allowed them to get into the city. They could have defended their own leadership. They didn't. Rosa Luxemburg was wandering around the street. They nabbed her off the street. It's ridiculous. There was. You can look at the sort of ridiculous tactics employed even in the early years of the Comintern, the sort of putschism of Zinoviev, or the Schlagetter tactic of Radek, attempts to ally with the far right and all this sort of stuff. It is sort of these really fundamental errors and mistakes that were made under these circumstances, as Roger also raises in terms of the general strike in Britain and the ridiculous reliance on the TUC and refusal to challenge the union bureaucracy, through the Anglo-Russian Committee and all this sort of thing. You go through all that stuff, but it's I think the vital point, of course, is about the actual conscious development of a revolutionary leadership in the working class, and that actually becomes an objective factor in history itself. The subjective question of the evolution of the leadership of the working class has now become an objective factor in history. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Ed?
Okay, sorry, I didn't realise I was unmuted already. Comrades, I'd like to thank, first of all, Roger very much for a really interesting and very thorough lead off on this question. And I think Carol actually raised a very interesting question as well. Is it the case that we wouldn't have had Stalin had it not been for Lenin? And I think that question actually enables us to focus on some of the features of this period. I mean, there's no doubt that in bourgeois histories of the Russian Revolution, the determination and the resolve of Lenin to his attention to detail and his the thoroughness with which he organized and the ruthlessness with which he was prepared to take politics in order to crush capitalism, that is very often portrayed as a sort of personality feature of Lenin by bourgeois historians. And it leads to this sort of parallel between what Lenin was doing and what happened later. But I think it's a misconception to see history in that way. There were, I think the real question is, had it not been for the isolation of socialism in a single country, would Stalinism have developed? And Lenin and Trotsky and all the leaders of the Bolsheviks from when they took power in October 1917, their preoccupation, their very first objective was to get this revolution spread, particularly into Western Europe, into Germany and Britain, France, where there was significant industrialization, because they knew that socialism has to be built on the most advanced, highest achievements of capitalism, which were the industrialized countries of Western Europe and to some extent the United States at that time. And what Lenin also made the observation in the build-up to the creation of the Russian Revolution and immediately afterwards, that the consciousness of the workers in Western Europe works slightly differently from the consciousness of the workers and peasants in Russia, because in Russia, there had been no reformism. In the workers of Britain and Germany had experienced workers' leaders in the Second International who, at some points in history, had gained some concessions for the working class. And therefore, at the end, I mean, there was there's no doubt, at the end of the Second World War, there was a revolutionary mood in the German army. There were, German soldiers were leaving their guns behind and going home. And there was a mutiny on the German fleet in Hamburg and so on. There's no doubt there was a revolutionary mood. But this is in a way, this is a parallel question to what we have today with the consciousness of workers in the world going on strike, but not being organized yet in political parties. This revolutionary mood in Europe didn't, in the first instance, take the form of workers aligning themselves with the parties of the Third International. They still had some illusions that the Second International, the leaders of the Second International, might do the job, and they hadn't worked out that they hadn't joined fully with the revolutionary methods of the Russian Revolution. That happened pretty quickly in 1918, and then in 1923 in Germany. And had there been very careful analysis of the tactics of the German communist movement in 1923, there's absolutely no doubt the German workers could have taken power. And I think, Roger can correct me, some comrades can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think at that time, some delegates from the German movement were in Moscow trying to get advice about the course of that revolution. Lenin was ill at the time, and Stalin, some of the hesitation and prevarication in the leadership of that revolution was already the responsibility of Stalin, who was beginning to creep into the leadership of the communist movement, who himself wasn't sure, or didn't have a clue about the tactics for the German Revolution. And the loss of the German Revolution in 1923 was a very, very big blow in isolating the Russian Revolution, where then the Russian workers realized that there was going to have to be some weight. And of course, then the undisputable errors of Stalin with the next revolution that came, which was the Chinese Revolution, of course, not in an advanced industrialized country, but still a huge portion of the world's population. And indisputably, huge clumsy errors, mistaken strategies, the responsibility of Stalin by that time. These were the things that led from the Russian Revolution being a temporary toehold of working class on the planet to a much longer term question of drawing out that holding on to that revolution in a drawn out process, awaiting for new opportunities in history. And just as you can have a revolutionary capitalist country,
breaking up, Ed.
We're seeing
Ed, you're breaking
sorry?
up. You're breaking up. You're breaking up. It might be added to your picture up. So you've got your bandwidth, concentrate on your speaking.
Stop here. Right.
Stop video.
Well,
Yeah.
This is really my last point.
Okay.
Just as it's possible to have a revolutionary movement in a capitalist country where the country remains capitalist, but there's a revolutionary push from the workers. It doesn't quite get to the point of changing society, but there's a revolutionary mood. It's also possible in a worker state, as Russia was in the early 1920s, to have a counter-revolutionary movement. It's a worker state. Property relations are changed in favor of the working class, but you can have a counter-revolutionary movement where the interests of international capitalism work their way into the politics of that country because of the particular conditions. And that was certainly the case. I think, you know, the reason for the rise of Stalin is not to do with either the politics or the personality of Lenin. The reason for the rise of Stalin was because in the circumstance where Russia was isolated, where counter-revolutionary features of the situation became predominant, it was somebody like Stalin who rose to the top of society, displacing the supporters of Trotsky and so on, because as Roger said, there was demoralization amongst the working class, and above all, because the material conditions for the construction of socialism did not exist, and it wasn't possible, therefore, for the masses to see the benefits of socialism straight away. And it allowed Stalin and his bureaucrats to consolidate their position as a privileged caste in the top of this society.
Okay, thanks, Ed. Dominic or John? I think it's probably John.
John.
Yeah.
Just a couple of brief points. I'm an avid watcher of the news channels on the television, and two things have come over to me recently, and they've come over from right-wingers who are commentators on these news channels. And one is the fact that within the Parliamentary Labour Party, there is either none or very few workers, people from a working class background. Recently, politics is the domain of people who've been to university, get jobs in trade unions or in the Labour Party as special advisors. And there is no, like, worker representation. The other thing that's coming over, again, in many cases from right-wing commentators, is the fact that there is now in this country, and I think throughout the world, particularly, say, in America, a gross disparity between the workers and their earnings and the capitalists, particularly the bigger capitalists and their earnings. The fact that the rich and poor are, you know, splitting, you know, further and further apart. When Blair was challenged on this issue when he was Prime Minister, his answer was basically, what does it matter? If the poor are getting more, then it doesn't really matter that the rich are getting richer. And he didn't see, or didn't want to see, the fact that if you've got this huge disparity between rich and poor, that inevitably, you know, it will lead to, if you like, a really gross disfiguration of society. Now, as far as I see it, you have a situation where many of the right-wing leaders, and I'm thinking of Donald Trump, I'm thinking of Orban in Hungary, and Boris Johnson in Britain, having a sort of attitude that has, if you like, in some perverse way, touched a nerve within the working class. And that is, if you like, an anti-socialist, an anti-intellectual approach, and they come over as being this populist thing. Unfortunately for them, we now have one or two rogues in the gallery. And I'm thinking particularly of Elon Musk, who's just gone into it like a bull in a china shop. And I forget the name, is it Twitter or something?
Twitter, yeah.
Over. and just sacking workers willy-nilly, which will inevitably in America lead to court cases, and hopefully will begin to, if you like, awaken the American working class that Donald Trump isn't their savior, that the ultra-right wing isn't their savior, and that they really need to be organized. In this country, we have the situation where there's a deafening silence from the Labour leadership, and particularly from Keir Starmer. The reason why, if you like, this wave of strikes has taken place is that over the last 10 to 12 years, which incidentally coincides with the Tory government's tenure of office, that wages have dropped by 20%. That's why you're getting, if you like, this huge wave of strikes taking place, because that people are beginning to look to food banks, etc. So from that point of view, I think we're in a much stronger place now than, if you like, there was a huge revolutionary movement after the First World War. But now that people are beginning to look at things, and they're not being given any guidance from the Labour leadership, they're not being told the reason why people are on strike is their wages have dropped over the last decade and consistently dropped, and that's why people are putting in for wage claims. So I'll leave it at that. I just see that the swing is coming against capitalism and against, if you like, that 12 years of Tory government, and against, I would hope in America, against the Tweedledum and Tweedledee of the Democrats and the Republicans.
Okay, thanks, John. Nobody's mentioned it yet, but of course what we have got now, which wasn't around the period we're talking about, is potential climate catastrophe, and I think that's going to have a major impact on what happens and how people behave, particularly young people. Would anybody else like to speak, or would anybody like to come back in that's spoken already? I don't see any hands coming up. Would Roger like to come back in and make a few more comments? Oh, hang on, Carol.
Well, a couple of things. One of them is just in response to the last, to Dominic. Was it Dominic? The Biden had essentially voted against the railway workers and for the bosses. So, people are beside themselves. And now the major organization in the United States, which is the DSA, which supports the Democrats, I'm assuming that there are lots of people who've gone into the DSA to try to recruit and pull people out of it. And there are revolutionary groups, people who consider themselves communists, who are going to be able to make much more inroads now that Biden did something for the left that the left couldn't even achieve itself. The fact that the railway workers, are the most powerful, workers in the United States, but have no sick days. They're dying on the job, and the Social Democrats are supporting the bosses, as opposed to supporting the workers. So I think that things are going to change, and they are changing. There's 48,000 people in California, workers who work for the university, who are out on strike, and the UAW is that union that's organizing the teachers by and large, and they're going out on strike in different parts of the country. But one of the things I wanted to say about Stalinism is that without Stalinism, capitalism, and I think everybody probably agrees with this, would not have been able to be resurrected. It's, the fact that Stalin supported capitalism, supported the fascists, supported the undermining of the working class. There's no way that capitalism, who knows the utter chaos and, that would have continued. Chaos did continue, but Stalin was a counter-revolutionary. And the problem is people who believed in him thought that they were making the revolution as opposed to the counter-revolution. And today, you know, where people for the most part won't say, oh yes, I think Stalin is a good guy, he murdered millions of people, they still carry on his approach, his Popular Front approach, his, you know, supporting you know, capitalist states in Vietnam and in China. You can't say anything bad about China because China is a revolutionary communist. And I deal with people like that sort of on a daily basis. So Stalinism is the last, unless we have another world war, which is certainly possible, is the last best hope, because it galvanizes the left into believing. I mean, I'm in the teachers union and in New York, and the people on the international committee are by and large Stalinists. And now they've come up with this new approach called multipolarity, which basically means the United States is the bad guy, is the worst bad guy in the world. And we have to support every single other government. So there are people in my union on this, in the international committee, who support the Iranian regime or support, you know, some other incredibly backward, oppressive regime, whatever it is, as long as it's an enemy of the United States. And this is something, unfortunately, that the petty bourgeois left in the United States has glommed onto. And so, you know, I'm always having debates with people about, you know, Iran, those people who are out on the street, they're out on the street because they're oppressed, not because the United States is trying to start a color revolution in Iran. But what I'm saying is that Stalinism has morphed into a variety of forms, but there are those people, and there's lots of them, especially the petty bourgeoisie, that can't figure out that it's the working class that needs to make the revolution. And so they support all of these reactionary regimes. I mean, I know Trotskyists that support Putin, and that the defending Putin is a nail in the coffin of American imperialism. It doesn't matter that, you know, that Russia is a completely capitalist state. And so what I'm saying is that we're going to have to come up with something systematic about dealing with this multipolarity, these morphing of Stalinism, because they're still around. And it was Stalin that, you know, maintained capitalism by supporting the bourgeoisies, and now it's Stalinism that's supporting all of these reactionary governments because the United States is the major enemy. So, you know, it's like the story is not yet finished. We're not ready. I mean, we're ready. The working class is militant, angry, going out on strike in the United States, maybe not to the same extent as in Britain, but also on the move. People are talking about capitalism. They're discontented, but it's the Stalinists, besides the trade union bureaucracy, where, you know, people hate them. On the other hand, they're fooled by the Stalinists. So we're going to have to do something comprehensive about dealing with those sort of, you know, philosophies that morphed out of Stalinism.
Thanks, Carol. Everybody else want to come in, or as I said before, Roger, do you want to come back and make some comments on anything that's been said?
Well, yes. It's been a wide-ranging discussion, and of course, has a lot of it was not directly related to the history of the Third International, but nothing wrong with that. That's exactly in the tradition of our meetings, that they're a forum in which comrades can express their ideas on anything that occurs to them in the course of the discussion. I think there was one direct question, if you like, from Carol near the beginning, when she said, well, you know, did Leninism lead to Stalinism? I think that kind of sums up the point. And of course, that's something which is plugged for all it's worth by the enemies of Marxism, that Lenin was a dictator, he was a gangster, he wanted to suppress the freedom of the working class. That look what happened. You see, you have a revolution, and it starts with all grandiose language, and look at what it ended up. It ended up with a horrible tyranny, a horrible dictatorship, and so on. And I mean, it's a very good weapon in the hands of the ruling class in order to frighten people away from the idea of revolution. But it does not stand up to a historical examination of what really happened. Now, Lenin was actually an entirely a champion of workers' democracy and a champion of freedom of discussion and debate. But of course, that's within the limits of the situation in which you find yourselves, the objective situation. Let us remember, Lenin he died, probably murdered, and he died in 1924, which was really Russia at that time was only beginning to recover from the most unbelievable barbarism that could be imagined. Yes, the miracle is that the Russian Revolution survived in any form whatsoever. The horrors and the hardships of the Civil War and the foreign intervention, all the armies of the world poured into Russia in order to crush the revolution. It's an incredible tribute to the tenacity, not just of the Russian workers, but of the world working class, that they were able to save the Russian Revolution in any form whatsoever. And during the Civil War, there was unimaginable horrors. The production actually was reduced to 1/9 of the previous level at the time of the revolution. There were millions. I think, if I remember the number right, I think it was 7 million homeless waifs and strays were roaming the wastelands. Young kids who'd been whose families had been destroyed by the Civil War, and who were literally just almost like animals, were just scratching an existence out of the bare soil. There was famine, there was cannibalism, there was mass outbreaks of infectious diseases. In that situation, I mean, Lenin could have been the nicest man in the world, but in that situation, you could not imagine that there would not be that you could have the kind of comforts of a democratic, social democratic kind of life. In that situation, concessions or special provisions had to be made. For instance, the suppression of debate within the Communist Party was not imposed throughout even the Civil War up until 1921, when there was a temporary ban. Of course, it wasn't temporary because Stalin saw to that, but a temporary ban was agreed on the rights of factions. But right up to that point, there would be the freedom of opposition factions to campaign for their points of view. That was all in the tradition of the Communist International and of Lenin and Trotsky. I can give many examples, but I don't want to labor the point. And there is it's just a horrible libel against Lenin to attribute the crimes of Stalinism to Lenin. Lenin fought from his deathbed against these violations of democracy on the part of Stalin. He made a block with Lenin, with Trotsky, in order to remove Stalin from the leadership because he was so scared. He said that we only have, I think I gave the quote already in my opening, that we have the same old Tsarist bureaucracy is still running the state machine now. That's why we need to make a block to fight against Stalinism. That's what he said. Of course, the Bolsheviks had the program of that no official should receive a higher wage than the average wage of the skilled worker. That was, of course, torn up into shreds by Stalin and the bureaucracy later. But you cannot attribute the gross privilege and corruption and the monstrous differentials that came later, that cannot be attributed to Lenin, and it was completely in violation of the traditions and the policies of Lenin and the Bolshevik Party. Also, another of the famous 4 points, apart from the limitation of wages, is that administrative duties should be not concentrated in the hands of professionals, in other words, of bureaucrats, but that they should be shared between, shared among the working class. That's why the very reason why he said, again in the quote that I gave, when he said that we should give up our Russian Revolution. If by giving up the Russian Revolution, we could ensure a victory of the revolution in Germany, we would do that. In other words, we would submit to the execution of the firing squads of the Russian fascists, rather than cling on to what slender, slim gains we have, if that meant that we could have a revolution in Germany where the level of culture and the level of the economy would be such that it could allow a more democratic flowering of a socialist society. All of these things, we need to really completely wipe the slate clean and show the reality of the traditions of Lenin and of Bolshevism, which were in complete and utter opposition to the corruption and the brutality of Stalinism. So, I mean, there's many more examples. I don't think I need to labor the points any further. I think on the other point, well, I mean, I agree with everything that the comrades have said. I agree with Carol also on the monstrosity that there are some people who consider themselves to be socialists or lefts who think that they have an obligation to support the crimes of Putin or the medieval barbarity of the regime in Iran. The point is that as our Iranian comrade said a few weeks ago at one of our meetings, we said actually the American regime considers, for all its for all the paper disputes that they have, that in fact that the Iranian regime was welcomed by the Americans in 1979 as the best alternative that they could settle for against a socialist revolution of the working class. I think I'm sorry that I've got some scribbled notes and I can't quite remember what they refer to now. But I think should we just leave that discussion for now, unless any comrades want to come back. The point is that we have to set the record straight. There is, well, I will say one thing, that as Dominic and other comrades said, that we're at the beginning. We're still actually really only in the early stages of this mass worldwide movement to revolt, which has begun. We talked about the strike wave in Britain, which nobody predicted that it would come. In fact, it was many lefts who would scoff academically at the idea that no, the trade union bureaucracy is too entrenched and they would never move, and they would. I mean, the point is that they're being swept along. The bureaucracy themselves are being swept along by the huge release of the pent-up anger of the working class in Britain, who cannot tolerate any further attacks and are determined to regain some at least of what they've lost. That there's a huge movement, and it's only just beginning now. And we're seeing, I don't want to stray now into a discussion on British perspectives. We've discussed it before, and we will, of course, no doubt return to it soon. But we can be sure that there's going to be huge movements, not only expressed in economic struggles and development of strikes, and I think developing despite the fears of the bureaucracy, which could lead to something like general strike action, but politically too. And I think we are inevitably, we're going to see, and this is something which our comrades in Britain are fighting for day in, day out, but I think we are going to see the building of a new workers' party, not a little sect outside of the mainstream, not one-man pop-up parties of people saying, please come and join us. This is you know, I'm your leader. I'm canvassing now for all rank and file to come and give some substance to. That's not the way a workers' party is created. But what I think we will see is a movement, just like we saw 120 years ago, a movement of the trade unions to break from the, as they said, from as they did then, from the Liberal Party, and from the, in fact, the what is really the alternative Tory party of Starmer, and to create a political expression once again of their needs. And they will choose their leaders, and they will formulate their own program, and they will form, in my opinion, a new mass party. And we're going to see the same thing. And we've, you know, who could have predicted the movement in every country from Latin America to who could have Carol and other comrades have talked about the prospects in the USA too, the strike movement beginning to develop again, the probable. I would again. I don't want to commit myself to something which maybe I'm not well enough acquainted with, but I mean the probable breakup of the two main parties, both the Democrats and the Republican Party, and the beginning of some move towards a new left party, a mass left party in America too, and the movements in Latin America, throughout most of the countries of Africa, throughout many of the countries of Asia. This movement which is coming, it's only just the beginning of a movement. Remember that yes, it's something like 80 years since the Communist International was shut down by Stalin, when in so many words they renounced the idea of world revolution and of socialist revolution for the future. It's that time, but that's because of the defeats of the 30s, the war in the 40s, the boom of the 50s and 60s, and it's taken a long time for the polarization in society to once again become a living reality. But I think now we're beginning to see a movement which is going to dwarf even the movements, the revolutionary movements of the period that we've been talking about in 1917 to 1920. So we will be discussing in a future meeting how and why a new international can be created. And otherwise, thanks for the discussion. Very similar.
We're not quite finished yet because Jimmy's got his hand up.
Oh, sorry. Jimmy. Okay. Yep. You're muted, Jimmy.
Yeah, if you're talking, we can't hear you because you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to come back on one point. I think it's important not to let slip off the discussion. After the Civil War in Russia, as Roger has mentioned, the country was destitute, and industry was leveled, agriculture was leveled, everything was down. And despite the fact that the seeds of the bureaucracy had been sown, the anti-democratic control that led to Stalinism had been sown. We have to acknowledge, as many members, ordinary rank and file members of communist parties around the world do, that gains were made for millions and millions of people on the back of plans, the 5-year plans. People in China, people in Russia, people in Eastern Europe, all saw their standard of living rise, despite the bureaucracy, despite the corruption, despite the mismanagement. And it's one of the arguments that, going back to Carol's question earlier in relation to Stalin being the nurturer and inheritor of Lenin, an awful lot of people that in my lifetime, I have heard so many praise and justify Lenin or Stalinism, and praise and justify Lenin or Stalin, the personality, as a major success, but more than that, as a model for a continuity. This leads to the distorted situation where you have support for Russia, and even worse, the grotesque interpretation of the support for Putin, and everything that he and the regimes like him in Belarus and other places represent. We have to accept and recognize that a lot of workers will have a distorted view of, and a different view of history, and different view of the stages of history to us. But it's done so in some cases, and in quite a lot of cases, on an understanding that under Stalinism, things got better for millions. Now, we have to explain how much better it could have been had there been a democratic system, had there been democratic control, had there been reinvestment back into the economies, just how much better it could have been for the rest of the planet as well. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thanks, Jimmy. Is there anybody else? Don't really intend to ask Roger to sum up again. I think he's probably done it. Any more comments? Roger, is there any final points you want to make?
Well, of course, Jimmy is absolutely right about that. Although the gains came more in after the 5-year plan was first put into practice, it was not really until the 30s that those economic gains began to be shown, and by that time, of course, the privileges of the bureaucracy had been firmly entrenched, and soon after that, there was the political bloodbath. I mean, millions of people suffered under the so-called purges, the absolute terror. A whole generation was wiped out. So not just a generation of Bolsheviks, but the working class was crushed as in terms of its political rights, just as harshly as the countries that were occupied by Hitler and in Germany itself. So, but nevertheless, because of the planned economy and because of the nationalization, there were economic gains. I mean, spectacular economic gains, which actually pulled Russia up from the kind of level of barbarism that I described before at the end of the Civil War in 1920-21 and the early 20s. It raised it to a superpower, to the second mightiest economic power on earth. It was, from the country of the wooden plow, it was sending satellites into space. So, I mean, there's no question about the economic thing, and the same is true of China. We see that there is the beginning, perhaps, of a protest movement against the privileges of the Chinese bureaucracy and against the bureaucratic ham-fistedness with which they've enforced their policies, including in relation to the lockdown. But at the same time, the reason why the regime is so apparent, has been up to now so apparently stable, is precisely because of the absolutely spectacular transformation of society in China, which has now become, by the way, a mainly urban society, which would have been completely unthinkable at the time of the revolution in 1949. So, I mean, in fact, it's a strange thing that China is the only country where, according to opinion polls, they favor capitalism. People say that capitalism is a good thing. It's the only country on earth, I think, where they found that in the opinion polls that have been tested. But of course, that would change. And in fact, as we'll discuss in the series on the future of the international, I think, just to give a little preview of what I would say on that, I think we're going to see that China will actually be the homeland. It'll actually be the birthplace of a new international, which I think was going to achieve what generations of workers have been fighting for over the last century and a half. So I think I'll leave it at that, comrades.
Okay, thanks, Roger. I mean, of course, in China, they're facing this draconian repression because of a new phenomenon that's come, which of course is the COVID crisis. So that's another factor in it, I think. I think if nobody's got anything else to say, we'll draw the discussion to a close now. I think it's been a very good discussion because we've not only talked about the history of what happened, we've talked about its implications for now and for the future and what might happen, and to look at what mistakes were made and what lessons can be learned and the way things may change in the light of factors that weren't around at the time of the Third International, which is the internet, which is the environment, which is COVID and all the other sorts of modern things that have come about. So I think in closing, I think they will play their part in future events as well. So if we could cross it into we've got another meeting next week. Can we return to you, Roger, for some information about next week's meeting?
Yes, next week we've got our, we're really very grateful and privileged. We're going to have our comrade Graham Atkinson, who is a lifelong fighter against fascism. He's taken personal risks, which few of us have had to suffer in order to fight. He's going to give a talk, or he's got to answer questions about his lifetime, more than half a century of fighting against fascists, not only in Britain but in Germany and internationally. And he did have some doubts as to whether he'd be able to physically, actually technologically to sign in, but I was very glad to see that today he did a little trial run, and he did briefly appear at at this meeting, so he will be there, and that will be our last meeting of the year. We're taking what I hope comrades will agree is a well-earned little rest for the holiday period. We meet again in early January. So I hope to see everybody next week.
Bye, everybody.
Okay, right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your attendance. Thanks for coming to the meeting. Thanks to Roger for his excellent lead off, and thank you for all your comments, which have led to a very useful discussion. So with that, I declare the meeting closed. See you all next week. Bye.
Comrades.